This is a story of the first story I ever finished, meaning it had a start and ended with a fairly solid plot, or so I thought. I was a bit of a macabre child. I like dark stuff. I'm not sure why, especially growing up in a household that was quite religious. My reading material was supposed to be airy, light and childlike, filled with innocent romances and splendid wonder. The movies I watched were usually of the Sleeping Beauty variety, with the evil stepmother so far away she didn't exist. However, movies like Watership Down snuck into my video library, and I read darker, more illicit stories. Just to add, a lot of the Nigerian movies I watched growing up were quite dark. We liked our stories of superstition, witchcraft and black magic. One day I had my grandfather come up to me. I was in my usual spot in the corner of the dining room with pen and paper in hand. He was about to go off to his multitude of meetings and simply wanted to know how I was. It was such an innocent question. "How are you, my dear?" He was unprepared for what came next. "I finished, Grandpa. Would you like to hear it?" He took a quick glance at his watch. "Okay," quickly. He sat beside me with a smile on his face. "How long did this one take you?" "Oh, many months," was my reply, "when it's finally finished." This is my first completed manuscript. The phrase manuscript was a new one to me, so I used it whenever I got the chance. Now the story begins with a married couple. They are very happy and love each other. However, one day the wife dies suddenly. His smile waned. The elders don't like us young ones talking about death. As a very superstitious people, it seems to invite tragedy. The words we speak come to life. Sometimes, they make you unspeak the words as though it reverses the curse. Anyway, on this day, my grandpa was not too thrilled about one half of a married couple dying. The husband marries a while after. "How soon after?" he interrupted. I wasn't sure it mattered. I also hadn't put a timeline down in my story, so his question irked me. "Let's say 5 months. His dead wife is still around though. She never left. She is still living in the house with him and his new wife." The truth was I was terrible at plotting, an affliction I still suffer from till today. My grandpa was beginning to look a bit concerned. "Do you know how the first wife died?" "Ah, but that's the mystery, Grandpa. They need to find out how she died, so she can find peace. You know, move on." I hadn't long finished watching Ghost with Patrick Swayze and Whoopi Goldberg, so the concept of ghosts moving on was very much a big thing to me. Was she ill, or... His voice drifted off, and I wondered what was wrong. Looking back on our encounter, I realized he was spooked. "That's the surprise, Grandpa. I'm getting to it. The dead wife, Toya, haunts the house, and then eventually is able to let her husband know she is there. He is confused by her presence and very upset. "What are you doing here? This is no place for the dead." Toya explains she must understand how she died, so she's able to move on. Her husband, his new wife, and Toya. Toya obviously can't be seen by them. Sit and discuss this. Toya asks her husband how she died, as she has no recollection. He tells her he walked into the bedroom and she was fast asleep, or looked fast asleep. On closer inspection, she was cold to the touch. She was dead. The mystery is why she hasn't moved on, since her death was apparently natural. This means she was murdered. But by whom? You can imagine my poor grandfather's face at this point. I had been fascinated with the idea of murders and killings as a child. Please don't judge me. This was a fascination that carried over into adulthood. I can tell you about most American serial killers, and I'm a big fan of true crime. Anyway, my obsessions aside, I cleverly thought it would be a brilliant twist, but seeing my grandfather's face made me realize not everyone was as fascinated with the subject as I was. It just wasn't a done thing. I really don't think the subject matter is suitable for a children's book, my grandpa said. But it isn't a children's book. I found the idea of him calling it a children's book insulting at best. I was trying to rise to a higher level and write more adult content that would evoke wonder and respect. It wouldn't be all fairies in the glen and magic. Then what is it? I looked blank. If you were going to present your story to a publisher, what category would it fall into? I must admit, the thought of pitching my story to anyone had never crossed my mind. Category? What on earth was that? I realized there was still much to learn. But my lack of knowledge made me belligerent. It's just a story, not a children's book. A story for grown-ups. Sensing my swift change in mood, my granddad wisely changed tact from efficient and business-minded to indulgent. Okay, carry on. I must say I find it very fascinating. They begin investigating her death. Her husband tries to recall her movements that day, but it's all foggy and she can't remember the moments leading up to her death either. The fact that it happened in the house means that whomever killed her would have been in the house with them. But I was the only one in the house with you, and the dog. Her husband insists it wasn't him, as he loved her. Then his new wife has an idea. She asks him to recall the day she died. If it was just the two of them in the house, together, and he is sure no one snuck in, then perhaps the killer is closer to home. My granddad was unusually quiet, and I'm sure I saw a bead of sweat on his forehead. They tried to recall what she would have been doing on the day of her sudden death. It was a Saturday, her husband remembered, and she liked to check on her flowers and spend time in the garden. She was worried as there was an unknown plant that had been trying to take over her flowers. She didn't know where this plant had come from. My grandfather looked vaguely interested at this point. It turns out, after further investigation, she was killed, but not by another person. It was the plant that killed her all along. It released a slow poison when she touched it. She felt tired, went to have a lie down, and that was it. That was why she couldn't move on. She didn't die naturally in her sleep like her husband thought, but was slowly poisoned. I was also fascinated with poisonings at this point, but I can't recall why. However, I've since come to realize poisonous plants don't quite work the way I think they do. And there was my story, all tidied up and presented in a pretty bow. Toyo was free to move on. My grandfather had a weird expression on his face when I finally finished. Pride that I could tell such a story, and perhaps horror that I could tell such a story. He never forgot that day, and as I got older, rather than asking me what I was working on, he simply encouraged me to keep writing, and on certain occasions would ask me if my stories were much happier. That was a difficult one. I just believed in writing stories. I didn't focus on happy or sad, love or tragedy. I just write it, and I hope it finds the right audience.